All right, thank you for that really kind introduction. I'm really enthusiastic about this talk today. This is a topic area I really like to talk about, but I'm really enthusiastic about the group as well, because I think this is the group that's going to carry on continuing to innovate in the area of parenting and helping us reach more families and ultimately help more kids be successful in their everyday lives. I should acknowledge the work that I'm going to talk about that follows was generously funded by a number of places. And you can't do any kind of treatment outcome research without lots of collaborators. And this is not an exhaustive list. I'm always humbled that the font gets smaller every year because I have to add more people that help me with the work that I do and lead with new ideas and new innovations. And then I also have to thank all the families and the teachers and the parents and the children that are part of all of our studies. We can't do any of the work we do without people graciously allowing us to pry into their everyday lives and learn about what's going on. And I'm very humbled by that, because that's a very kind thing that people are doing for the families that will be walking in their same shoes in a few years and maybe won't have as tough of a road to travel because of the pavement that they've laid down. I have kind of a little bit of a parallel agenda for today. I did not have the luxury of having the early career researcher's toolbox when I was an early career person, and I kind of bumbled along like Mr. Magoo and made tons of mistakes, and then lucky that there were a lot of gracious people that helped me. And I think that toolbox is a wonderful addition to it's probably a book everybody should buy earlier in their career. And it's not an endorsement to Dr. De Los Reyes did not pay me to say this. This is my own personal opinion. Brad Smith actually told me early in my career that I should read the Checklist Manifesto, which was a book about how making lists and being accountable to those lists and walking down them really can promote more adherence to your goals and what you want to do. And so I bought that book and read it, but that was a general book. This is a particular one to early career researchers, which is a step even closer to probably what's going to be helpful. I'm going to talk a little bit about the evidence-based for parenting programs to support fathers. I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've done on our own team as a way of formative work in this area of enhancing parent involvement and engagement. And then I'm going to end with some future directions. There's just tons of places where we can continue to learn about what's going to best support the families we work with. And I hope that some of those slides will help spur some of the directions in the breakout groups afterwards. I'm also going to pop in a couple of these bubbles throughout about lessons I learned along the way that might be worth people speculating or talking about as well. So there's no question that parenting is one of the key promoters in resilience amongst children. It can be an enabler of overcoming barriers or obstacles. When parenting isn't working well, it's also an area that can demote the effectiveness of what families are trying to do. And there are numerous researchers that have done really seminal work in the area of training parents and supporting parents and figuring out the best approach to helping support their kids. Most of the work that I do thinks about the social learning theory and the coercive process that Patterson pioneered a long time ago. Basically, when I think about parenting, you think about if you have a kid with a difficult temperament or more misbehavior, that's really going to put parents on their heels, right? You think about those parents, they're parenting a lot more than a typical parent has to parent. All parents make mistakes, but if your volume of parenting mistakes is low, the risk of things going off the rails is not as high. If you have a kid that's non-compliant almost every time, or talks back or tantrums quite frequently, well, those maladaptive parental responses where you don't answer quite correctly, the magnitude of them increases greatly, and therefore the potential damage that those responses can do increases as well. And so we know from Patterson's work that if you look at families with children with challenging behaviors, those parents have more maladaptive parental responses, and they become more inconsistent, right? They may have times where they decide, I'm going to draw a line in the sand and I'm going to stick to my guns and I'm not going to let your tantrum beat me today. But oops, it did. I got too tired and I gave in, right? And so now that child gets the message that, oh, I just have to tantrum for 30 minutes, and then I'll get my way. And so the next time they're going to come up to bat with at least 30 minutes of crying and wailing and carrying on. And that's going to make it harder for the parent to stick to their guns the next time, and then rinse and repeat. And what happens is, what I see a lot of times at schools when I show up for assemblies, or maybe I'm at a large parent meeting at a school, and there's always a couple of kids that aren't sitting next to their parents. They're just ripping around the auditorium, like not listening, running and running and running. And I have a lot of empathy for the parents of those children, because I always think, perhaps that's a parent who has been dealing with this coercive process for a long time, since 2 or 3 years old. And they know if they try to stop that kid from running around, they're just going to pour gasoline on this fire and make a bad situation worse. And so they're willing to accept, okay, my child will break this rule or this social norm. And that's, I'm going to have to live with that, because the alternative is they might start really acting out or say something really loud and rude, and now that would even be more embarrassing. And so when we work with kids in our clinic or in our programs, it's always important to remember that this process may have been working in the background for years, or maybe even a decade if I'm working with a 10 or 11-year-old. And any of our treatments, if they're going to undo this process, are going to have to work not for a week or 8 weeks or a couple of months. It's going to be a long-term plan to really unwind some of these processes that have been formed over time. And if you don't believe me, if you're thinking, well, what does this guy know about theory, or that Patterson paper was from a long time ago, it was in the 60s. I'm going to show you a quick video clip of how I created a coercive process in my own living room within 2 minutes. We're doing a study with Head Starts where we're working with fathers and videotaping them helping their child get through a soccer skill drill pre and post treatment. And we're interested in looking to see how many commands they used, how much praise they used, the traditional parenting skills that you might care about in a parenting program. And we had undergraduate students coding these videos. So I had to create some sample videos for the students to watch so that they could get a practice with using the codes before we put them as coders on our live data. And so my daughter Mary was kind enough to volunteer, and I first filmed a video with her where I was a really fun, engaging parent. I praised, Mary, I'm so proud of you. That was a great job, the way that you did that. I had a video as a kind of a neutral parent where I just kind of gave her the instructions and then didn't say anything and let her do what she was asked to do. And then the last video I filmed with her, I aimed to be a more coercive parent. So I was trying to give more commands, demands, reprimands, and minimize the amount of praise that I offered during the example. And so what I'd like to do here is just pause for three minutes or so, give you a chance to watch this video, and then we'll come back and think about that video in the context of the families that we often work with in our programs. Okay, well, the first thing I need to say is no child was harmed in the filming of that video. We split a bag of Skittles after that and everything was okay. And we've moved on. I noticed we lost about 50 participants after that. They're like, how could this guy be an expert in parenting after that performance? But if we take a moment to think about what happened there, I'm an optimist about children. I've never met a child in my whole career that showed up saying, I want to fail at this task and do a bad job and have you yell at me. That's never happened once. And in fact, that didn't happen in this video, right? She showed up. I had a developmentally inappropriate task set up for her with the cones too close to the furniture. I was asking her to do some gross motor tasks that clearly she hadn't been able to build a lot of competency in that area yet. And yet, she took the ball and she was ready to start to kick it. She even said, Daddy, you got to move the cone over a little bit. I mean, she was being pretty socially appropriate and correcting her parent for the bad job he did at setting this up. And yet I approached it in a very directive, authoritarian way. If we were to count the number of commands, demands, reprimands versus the amount of praise, my ratio would have been way off. Something I'm a little bit embarrassed about and a bit ashamed about as a parent. When I look at that video, I didn't script it or do anything on purpose. My first reaction to her when she started throwing the tantrum wasn't to reason with her, problem solve. I just picked her up, right? She was a preschooler. I'm going to pick her up and move her back to the spot where I want her to go to. And I'm thinking to myself, if that was my reaction in this situation where this was a mock-up and not even a real high stakes situation in a family, what's happening in the minds of the parents I work with when they're having a child have a full-blown, as they call major meltdown, right? And it is a high stakes situation. So I show that video is just an exemplar of how easy it is for these negative patterns to be created. And then if we think about this, wasn't just one instance in the living room with Mary in this made up situation, but this was happening in the household multiple times a day, every day of the week, all the weeks in the month, for all the months and years in a row. Imagine what's happening in the families in terms of the strength of these negative interactional styles. And I think it really calls for the need for us to do our best to create the best and the brightest interventions to try to undo this when we work with families. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit now and narrow the direction of the topic to talk about parenting and fathers. So there are lots of examples of good fathers. We can think of some examples of bad fathers. And when we think about why focus on fathers, we know that, number one, it's a national priority. We also know that father involvement in public health initiatives lags behind mothers, and our research base is not as strong in terms of what's going to work best with fathers relative to mothers. And then one of the things that it's not as simple as saying, if you build it, they will come. We need to think really carefully about the mechanisms that we're using to try to involve and engage fathers in approaches to promote positive parenting. And I'm not sure that we can say that, well, we can just use the same strategies we use with other parents or other caregivers. And we may have to think to some degree about tailored approaches based on some of the things we know about fathers. And it is critically important to involve dads. So dads uniquely contribute to language development and early literacy skills. There are things dads do that moms don't. Dads talk louder to young children. They use more complex vocabulary. They use more unfamiliar words in their language with young children, and this promotes some of the language and early literacy skills we really care about. My colleague Anil Chaco did a great study. I was really lucky, he invited me to be part of it on working with fathers in Head Start to help promote their shared book reading in an effective way with their children. And he showed something that's very hard to do, and I'll show you a slide later, that the distal outcomes, the children's early academic skills improved in addition to the proximal outcome, which was their parenting. We also know that dads uniquely contribute to the development of appropriate socialization skills and peer relationships. And we are also working within a context where fathers' roles in childcare is increasing. The demography of fathers used to be that childcare responsibility and roles was less so, but that is changing. And so that means as clinical scientists, we need to be adapting to that change and making sure that our treatments aren't becoming stagnant and not reflective of what's really happening in families. So one question is, why aren't fathers involved in behavioral parent training studies? And I wanted to take just a break here and comment on how I even got interested in this area. When I was in graduate school, I was really lucky. I worked 7 summers in Bill Pelham's summer treatment program. I worked as a counselor, worked as a teacher in the classrooms there, and then I also ran the parent training. And one of the things that I always enjoyed was at the end of the day, all the parents would line up in a line of, it would be 12 parents all in a line for the 12 kids in the group. And they would sometimes show up early so that they could talk with one another. And I'd have the opportunity when I taught in the classroom to go out early and chat up the parents. And I got to meet lots of them. And I met lots of the moms, I met lots of the dads, I met grandparents, I met uncles, older siblings. And one of the things I noticed was on the parent management training night, the parents would stay late, we'd serve pizza for the kids would have childcare, and the parents would go to the parenting class. That for some of the families, the dads would pick up on that day, take the kid home, the mother would show up in another car and attend the parent training group, and oftentimes complain about what was going on with the child and the father, and those people weren't present. And so we started to think about why is that? And because we had a captive audience, we had a chance to ask some of the dads, well, why don't you come on Monday night to our parenting group? And one of them told me, that's just a lot of people talking on about stuff. And I thought, well, that was what the person got out of the class we were offering. Maybe our class needs to change. And then the other thing we did, we were always taught in our lab in graduate school to go back to the literature and review the literature. And we're surprised to find out that there wasn't a lot of information out there about dads. So I don't know if people had the same experience of me as a graduate student and as an early career professor. I was always feeling like I got scooped. Every time I had a good idea, I would go back to the literature, I'd read something like, oh, they did this 20 years ago, and they did it 10 times. Why this idea isn't any good anymore? Somebody already answered it. And so with this idea of fathers and parent training, I thought I found a place where there was room to grow a program of research and to study something really in depth. And myself and the other members of our team thought, well, maybe this will be a niche that we can look at. It turns out back in 1999 when we did the initial review, and then in the Future Directions review, we came to fairly similar conclusions, is that fathers are underrepresented in these studies. And we found 30 behavioral parent training studies, included almost 2,000 kids. It's clearly a well-established treatment. Oh, I guess my aside here is, I think I got bad advice when I was a new professor at Buffalo. Somebody told me I had too many multi-author publications. I need to stop collaborating with other people. I need more single-author publications. So of course, like anybody, I panicked, and I thought, okay, I'm going to put together this review. But I guess looking back, I'm proud on my resume. This is the only single-authored publication I have. I've been very fortunate to have awesome collaborators on every other paper I've put out. And so I guess that's a cautionary tale. You don't always have to take the advice of the senior people in the department. You might want to get a second opinion for some of the things they say. But when we did review this literature, at that time, there were no studies that specifically dealt with dads. Oftentimes, the results were only reported for moms, or it was for parents combined together. And in the majority of studies, didn't say anything about dads at all. So it was very hard to base some conclusions on whether or not the approaches we were using clinically in parenting programs across the country were just as good for dads as they were for the moms that typically attended. When you looked at the whole literature, if you include conduct and oppositional defiant disorder symptoms, the same results kind of came to hold. Some of the studies that did talk about fathers had kind of equivocal results. It wasn't clear whether or not it made a difference to include them in parent training or not. But then there were some other studies that showed it really did matter if you included dads, and that they benefited uniquely from the parenting programs that we were using. And so here we thought we found a pressure point, that because there was some controversy about whether we should include dads or not, this is maybe a fruitful area to follow up and to think about. So when we summarized everything, there were very few studies that specifically addressed behavioral parent training outcomes for fathers, even though we already knew that this was an evidence-based approach for kids with ADHD, which is the group we were working with. So then we started thinking, well, why are dads under-involved? We really started brainstorming. And the first thing we did is reflect on our own practice amongst the families we were working with. And one of the first things that we noticed is that we addressed most of the correspondence that was going back and forth by mail or email was to the mom, and the dad wasn't included in that correspondence at all. And so this was one place where we were perhaps already marginalizing the dad right from the get-go. We also were guilty of emphasizing mothers' ratings, because the ratings we were using were normed on moms. They were often the easiest person to ask to fill out the checklists. And so we, at times, never asked dads for their opinion about their kid at all. Or if there was a a choice between asking the mom or the dad, they both showed up for the intake appointment, for example, we would give all the paperwork to the mom and ask her to fill it out. And that was one of the things we stopped doing once we recognized that that was one of our practices back then. And then we also know that the standard clinical hours of clinics, if they're a typical workday, that's going to be difficult for any working parent, moms or dads. And so we made a decision to become more flexible for all the parents we work with to be maximally inclusive. Parents of kids with ADHD, the group we're working with, also have a greater likelihood of having ADHD themselves. We know that that can impede progress in a parent training program. And most parenting classes are classroom-based. They do a lot of talking and discussion and introduction. And that format may discourage dads, as there's some evidence that dads prefer more hands-on practice in learning activities relative to moms. Well, I have to acknowledge the PLEC point that we've used for a long time, that dads rarely take primary responsibility for any caretaking task, and then have to follow up by saying this is gradually changing, that is not quite the case, is not quite as rigorous of a finding as it was in the past. We do know that fathers' participation in recreational activities and unstructured play, though, has been consistently dominant in all demographic studies that have been done. And therefore, we should think about whether the content of the behavioral parent training classes addresses what dads really care about, what is meaningful to them. And I had an example of this in a pilot study we did when we were working with dads, where a common problem with kids with challenging behaviors is getting them ready for school in the morning. And I brought up that example. In the 8 dads that were in the group at that particular time, 0 of them did anything with getting their child ready for the school in the morning. Now, that could have just been an unlucky draw, but it was also a place where I did some self-reflection as a clinician, and it made me think, I got to be really careful to check my assumptions about what parents are doing or what's important to them, and that they should be bringing to me what they want to talk about, as opposed to giving these exemplars, because they may not be the exemplars for the group of parents I'm working with. We also know in terms of engagement, and this is where some of the future directions I think really need to focus upon, men generally don't seek out health or mental health services. So we know that men are less likely to follow up with recommended cancer screenings or show up at the doctor with symptoms significant for cancer. And so they often end up at later stages relative to women and have more serious mortality outcomes. They don't do routine things like go for colonoscopies as recommended or supposed to. We know that men that suffer from depression or anxiety are less likely to show up in mental health treatment. And parent training is no different than those findings, that even though a male caregiver may benefit from parent training, they are less likely than the maternal caregivers to show up in our treatment programs. And this is in spite of very clear problems in parenting. The MTA study showed very clearly that moms and dads both said that their kids had problems, but it was only the mothers that had a realistic perception that their own parenting might be contributing to some of the problems, and therefore treatment might be indicated. And the dads had a more delusional point of view, maybe not exactly the right term, but that their kid had problems, but they didn't have any role in exacerbating those problems at all. And so if somebody's thinking like that, we wouldn't expect to see them in our treatment programs. So based on all of this, our team got together and we thought maybe we should develop a father-focused approach to dealing with parents, and we developed the program. The coaches program really synergizes 2 manualized treatments that were available for ADHD. It includes the Pelham Summer Treatment Program and Chuck Cunningham's really excellent community parent education program. So I guess this is a lesson learned too. I always felt a lot of pressure that I need to do something, I need to create something or make a big splash. And now looking back and really from the guidance of the mentors I had, that's not how science works, right? Science is small incremental steps that build upon the prior ones and replicates and extends what others have done before. And so I'm real glad that I was able to use components from these two programs that were well vetted and well researched and package them together in a slightly different way to try to address this particular goal that we were looking to achieve. In the coaches program, we have a standard parenting course. So the parents learn how to catch kids being good. They learn how to use timeout prudently. They learn how to give good commands. And at the same time, the kids practice soccer skill drills. They learn how to dribble, shoot, or pass. I don't know if everybody on the call knows about kids with ADHD, but they often have really poor sports competencies, because if you think about it, the 5-year-old that doesn't pay attention and sits down in the middle of the infield and just starts throwing the dirt up in the air and or picking the daisies in the outfield, the parents of that child might make a decision to say, yeah, maybe this isn't the best thing for our kid, and we don't want to sit here on the sidelines and watch the kid not listen to the coach or participate. And so they stop those activities. And unfortunately, and a consequence of that is by the time the kid is 9 or 10, they haven't learned how to play these games or interact with other kids in these team sports in a way that their peers have had the opportunity to figure out. So we work real hard to build competencies. You'll see our typical sessions are reflective of a typical parenting program. And then during the second hour, we put the kids and the fathers together for a soccer game. The fathers coach the game by using the strategies they just learned. So if anybody's ever been to a Little League game, you know that coaching is often not evidence-based. In fact, I always think I can fairly well diagnose the kid with ADHD on the soccer field or the basketball court within a couple minutes, because I hear, John, turn around. John, stop that. John, come back here. John, sit down. John, get in the game. John, put that down. John, it's not time for a water break. John, right? How fun can that game be for that poor little kid who's getting their name called and yelled at them a dozen times, when that probably also happened on the bus and in the classroom and during dinner and all of that. We work really hard to teach the dads to use a positive approach where they're catching kids being good, they're minimizing commands or demands, and we empower them to be the coaches to do that. One of my colleagues, Karen Hulme, had a really great idea. She said, well, we give the kids jerseys because they're on a team. She said, we should give the parents jerseys that say coach on the back. And I thought, well, okay. Turns out they loved it. The parents wore those t-shirts every single session. They walked around, they were the coach, and then they were empowered to be on the field and work with the kids. We also incorporate breaks into the game to make sure that we can give the dads feedback. They give feedback to one another, and they reinforce each other for successful implementation. We did this based on some pilot work, and I guess I wanted to emphasize the importance of doing pilot studies before rolling out a larger study. Initially, I was planning that we would do some spot shadowing, somewhat like PCIT, where we would be next to the parent and watch them interact with their children and then give them some feedback on what they might try differently during the context of the game. And the first week we tried that, Dad turned around to me and said, "Get out of my face." And so then we thought maybe we need a less directive approach for the dads we're working with here, and we use these peer groups to do that. I also should say that our pilot study and all the studies that followed needed a lot of staff to work with the kids, to work with the parents, to run the parenting group. And the only thing that we were able to offer is invite them to be part of our team and be co-authors. And that allowed us to do a lot of the formative work on a shoestring that we couldn't have done otherwise. And very grateful for the contributions and the good ideas that people offered as we did that. We also use a coping, modeling, problem-solving approach, which Chuck Cunningham really pioneered. The facilitator facilitates the discussion amongst the parents, but doesn't prescribe any direct advice. And that turned out to be really important for our dads, where they could come up with their own ideas. It's not inconsistent with a motivational interviewing type approach or other approaches that are really person-centered. Dads could watch exaggerated parenting errors, and then they would identify the errors, but then talk about what alternatives they would do themselves. And that turned out to be a really positive treatment model for working with dads. We have a little daily report cards for the kids during the games. We have some materials we use. And then as I mentioned, the kids' competency building we feel is really important too. We want to improve their sports skills so that their dads and their moms and their grandparents, when they show up for our end of the session banquet on the final session, that they all see the child improve and how well they can kick the ball and be part of the team. Because this is something kids do. Kids are involved in phys ed or after school programs or community programs in sports, and we want the kids we work with to do just as well in those activities as other kids. Talked a little bit about this game. We have our own staff keep track of the score and referee and monitor gameplay, but the dads, we tell them that this is a different kind of Little League. You can go right out onto the field and work with your child if you need to. And we also give them an assignment each quarter to keep track of some things. So they have a little card where they're keeping track of their kids' behavior, but if you look all the way at the bottom here, they also self-monitor their use of whatever the skill of the week is. So if it's labeled praise, they keep little tick marks of how many times they were able to say something positive to their child about the gameplay. And if you've been to a Little League, there's all kinds of opportunities. I like the way you passed. That was nice how you volunteered to be on defense. I really think you're paying attention well right now. The ball could come down here anytime. They could do all those things. And having done these programs lots of times, it's always interesting. The first week, we have our first subgroup meeting, and we ask the dads to look at their cards, and they all stare at their shoes, and nobody gave any praise. It was silence. You could hear the crickets. By the third session, it is the most positive, fun, enthusiastic, engaging sports event you've ever been at. The dads are praising their own kid. They're praising other people's kids. They're slapping high fives with one another. I guess now it'll be elbow taps next time we're able to get on the field. But they're really able to take the skill and apply it immediately, which we think is an important thing. We send a little newsletter home every week to the kids about who was a good sport and who did a good job. Little kids love to get mail. They never get it. And that is also one of our engagement strategies. We always put at the bottom when our next program time and date will be to remind the parents. So one of the things we do is we try to not approach parents as deficient in parenting. Even the name parent training has a bit of a pejorative tone to it. We call it a coaches program because we feel like the parents can be proficient coaches for their children. We try to frame treatment in a way that reduces stigma. And we think that the fun activities that are embedded within the treatment really make a big difference. Parents tell us, my kid doesn't like to go to anything. He always gives me a hard time about getting ready, but on Saturday morning, he's got his sneakers on at 7 a.m. and he's ready to go out, come to the game, and he enjoys the activity. So because the kid likes it, that's also a draw that the dads are going to show up because their kid is pushing them to go to. You can contrast it with some of the teenagers I've worked with in parent-teen negotiation. They give their parents such a hard time about coming to the clinic to talk to the clinician that the family drops out because it's just not worth having another battle with my kid about the treatment that was supposed to help me stop having battles with my kid, right? So we have a couple of studies I'll show you about. The first study we did was coaches versus a waitlist, which is the initial test of efficacy. We were able to show that dads at the end of treatment that got coaches praised more, and you might say big whoop, 4 praises versus 6 praises, but in a 30-minute interaction to increase by 2 positive labeled praise statements, if you extrapolate that across a whole day, the 3 to 4 hours, we know that dads are available to be engaged with their child on average in a typical household. That's 8 more praises a day, and then in a week, that's 56 more praises. In a month, that's 200. And if you think about the trajectory of a family that's having more of these positive interactions with their child relative to the ones staying the same, stable, you can imagine that that's cultivating much different father-child relationships than the one that isn't going through an intervention like this. They also rated their kids' behavior as less intense at the end of treatment. So, and they were highly satisfied. The dads that participate in coaches said that they really liked it and they liked the treatment process by and large. So then we thought about a comparative effectiveness trial. Okay, how would coaches compare to a typical program, dads in a group parent training program versus coaches? We found that dads that were in the coaches program rated their kids as improved relative to the traditional approach where the average score was closer to unchanged. We know that we found that the attendance was greater. So in the coaches program, parents attended about 80% versus about 65% of sessions. Child attendance was better. So in the coaches program, the dads almost always brought their child with him unless the child was sick. If you look at child attendance in the traditional program, the children who were in just a group, childcare group, eventually didn't attend quite as frequently, even though the dad attendance was a little higher. Homework completion, well, one finding here is that dads just don't do their homework. If you look at the percentage of homework completed, it's all very low, which I think argues for what we do in coaches, where we have the dads practice the skills immediately right after they learn them. And homework completion is just a proxy for practice during the week. And so if you can create a forum for the dads to practice right away, this is a way potentially to enhance outcomes. The dads were less likely to drop out of coaches, and they were more satisfied with the process that we used. So then, I guess now in the aim of thinking about future directions, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the future directions in our work, and then future directions, I think, for the larger field in terms of working with dads and parents. As I mentioned, my colleague Anil Chaco did a really nice paper where he would create a Spanish language adaptation of coaches for Head Start preschools. And they didn't have gymnasiums to do soccer, and the kids were little, they were 3 and 4 years old. So what the Head Start partners wanted to work on was early literacy skills. And so he focused on shared book reading. And he randomly assigned half the dads to Waitlist or half of them to a coaches program where they learn parenting strategies, but also learn dialogic reading strategies, how to use language more effectively when talking about a book, as opposed to the rote reading that many of us may have grown up with, where a parent just reads the book to you. Here, the point is to have a conversation about the book and the content of the story and use many words, not only the words in the book, but your own words as a parent, to foster the child using more words during this conversation. His study showed that not only did you get a moderate effect on parenting skills, the ECB intensity again looked like about the same kind of effect we got in prior work, and positive and negative parenting improved. I know because I have lots of non-significant findings in this area that distal outcomes are really hard to achieve in an 8-week waitlist controlled trial. And yet, in his study with these young children, their language did improve after a course of 2 months of the parents using this dialogic reading with the kids. I think it's a quite remarkable finding, one that needs replication, but should be chased, because if we can show that dads can uniquely contribute to their kids' early literacy skills, this is a potentially underutilized resource that could really help lots of kids with early school success. And compliments to Nell for even thinking about this as an idea. We also have started to think about, can we get the program away from being run by our clinical staff, and can we get it embedded better in the community? So one of the things we're just working on, we have a paper under review with my colleague Nikki Schatz at FIU. We trained phys ed teachers to run our coaches program and school counselors to run the parenting piece of our program, and we embedded it within schools for kids that had ADHD related behaviors that were referred for disruptive behavior in school. And we tailored the content of the program a bit to include things like school-based DRC to manage homework time better, to help with organization of the homework area. And the findings largely replicated what we found in clinical samples, that the coaches in schools, fathers reduce their rates of negative talk during a brief parent-child interaction, and they increase their frequency of praise actually quite a bit. And So we're thinking that this could be a model that could be used in the commonly deployed after school programs, Saturday programs, other community centers that are where kids often are at, and they're the places we're often trying to recruit from to get people to come into our clinic. That one of the future directions is going to be trying to figure out, well, how can we embed these kinds of strategies in the places where the children and families already are, and not try to get them to make those extra steps. In that same vein, one of the students working with me, Abby Caserta, and I ran a after school program in Head Start preschools. One of their mandates was to get better father involvement. And so one of the things we thought was, well, we could run an after school soccer program. And we invited whole families to come to this. That was important for our Head Start partners to not be exclusive of any child. They want every child to be able to participate. So the only rule is you had to have a caregiver that came with you to the after school program, but that caregiver could be anybody. It was a bit of a watered down program because we only had an hour, and so we couldn't do our hour-long parent training programming. We did a 5-minute skill of the week where we taught the parents something that we wanted them to work on, and then we had our little breakouts within the program. And that adaptation appeared to work in some ways, but maybe wasn't intensive enough in other ways. So we didn't get our typical finding for labeled praise in this sample. The pre-post or the comparison between the people that got the coaches versus a waitlist was no different. But we did reduce negative talk. So it seemed like there was, perhaps because of the skill of the week, but also maybe because of the parental monitoring, seeing lots of other parents engage and caregivers engage with their children in the soccer game and not be negative, or giving parents almost permission to just let their child play and not to worry about so much the outcome, focus on the process. So we want your child to have fun here and be well during this hour. The negative talk was reduced in the coaches like programming. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about these future directions. There were general, and one of the things we did in the paper we put together, which I guess was a little idiosyncratic for the future direction papers, but appreciate the graciousness, including some of the review we did. We reviewed intervention studies and that included fathers to look to see, what was the general finding within the literature. And what we found was what we found back in 1999, that there was a lot of diversity across the designs of the studies, the interventions or treatments that are included, and the eventual assessments. Something that we think is really important, I hope there are people on this in the meeting today that are interested in picking up this baton and carrying it. The construct of co-parenting isn't often investigated. And so we often think about it is investigated, but perhaps not as much as it should be in some of these studies. We often think about collecting mother ratings, father ratings, teacher ratings, and the co-parenting that may change in the context of the treatment is a harder construct to reliably assess. And that might be something that more continued good work needs to be done to try to integrate that into our typical parenting intervention studies. Something else we noticed in the studies was that attrition, which is really important for people interested in engagement and inclusion in treatment, wasn't often uniformly assessed or well described. And that's something that we're going to have to get a lot more precise with in our reporting if we're really going to learn about what sort of approaches work best for dads versus those that maybe aren't quite as effective. And then there are measurement problems. I'll tell you, I was guilty of this myself with my first project. The comparative trial was actually part of my dissertation. And I got to my dissertation defense, and one of the committee members there made an excellent point. He said, well, this is very interesting. You did a measure of this parenting program. You have no outcomes related to parenting in this study. And I thought, oh, I'm going to fail, because he was right. I had not, we had focused on mostly distal outcomes, the child behavior, the family functioning, and didn't focus so much on how much the parents changed. And that error is present in other studies within the literature as well. when we came up with recommendations for the article, we really thought about 4 areas that we thought might be the quickest for moving the needle. One is focusing on how to best include fathers in our studies. One is how to best engage fathers. One is how to, then once engaged, how do we retain the fathers, and then how do we measure outcomes? And I guess there's a couple of recommendations, and then there are a couple of areas for future directions. One of the things we've tried to model in our own lab is to enroll all caretakers in studies. So oftentimes we're just trying to make our recruitment targets and get people consented and get the kids enrolled so we can run them. But we've tried to work hard to invite right from the outset all the caretakers, get the consent for all of them to participate in our study, and then collect our study measures from everybody who's present. And that we may not use all of those study measures as part of our primary outcomes, but we're first of all honoring the fact that multiple people are invested in this child that we're working with. The other thing that we're doing is including people right from the get-go to try not to marginalize any particular caregiver. I think we have to broaden the definition of father too. And all the papers I write, I have to qualify that I'm using that term as a placeholder for any male caregiver, and that role is as broad as it needs to be. And then something that does need more exploration are the side effects of greater father inclusion. If we really are trying to emphasize including dads more, well, are there consequential effects of that on the other caregivers? How does that impact the child or the family unit? And sometimes these results may be unexpected. So there was a recent study in Spain that was looking at the provision of paternal leave for fathers when they have a new child. And what that study found was that there were beneficial effects of that, but that there was also a decrease in those fathers' desire for more children. So as they spent more time with their new child, they shifted what they thought were the number of children they would want to have. And there could be a couple of reasons for that. One is that as they spent more time with that child, they may have decided they wanted to invest more time in that particular child they have. Another reason might have been that the child's mother may have been able to go back to work sooner because the father was contributing more to the early childhood caretaking, and the mother may become more attached to the job. Or it could be something else. So I think that study makes me think that there are consequences to some of the decisions we make about trying to be more inclusive that we want to study and we want to learn more about so that we can best support families going forward. We also know that engagement is a huge area that needs more research. Michael Lindsay has been a terrific pioneer for all of us in really thinking about the construct of engagement, and I direct everybody to a really good review from a few years ago and his more contemporary work. But we do know that treatment preferences vary between moms and dads. So Dan Washbush did a good study of preferences, whereas for kids with ADHD, mothers were more open to the idea of medication. Fathers were very closed to that idea. So even within the same family for the same child, there were big differences in what parents found as acceptable approaches for the treatments they would like for their child. We also think in terms of engagement, I think this doesn't just apply to fathers, it probably applies to all the people we work with, that to try to meet the parents more where they are physically located, as opposed to trying to get them shoehorned into our clinic in the hours that are convenient for us, and to think about the contexts and the situations where kids are interacting with others and experiencing impairment and putting treatment there. A related point to that in engagement speaks to developmental transitions that are important to fathers. So we did a study a few years ago with teenagers with ADHD who are learning to drive. And I can tell you, our father involvement in that study with adolescents learning to drive was way greater than our typical involvement of fathers when we work with 6 or 7-year-olds in parenting programs. And that makes me wonder if there are particular aspects of the child's functioning or these particular developmental transitions that will serve as levers to really address the dads and get them engaged with the sorts of services and interventions that we're looking to implement. I think probably like a lot of scholars, with recent events, I feel strongly that Black Lives Matter, and I've been reflecting back on my old work and thinking about, have I been inadvertently making errors in my approach to any different group within the research that I'm doing. And I think a huge area that the entire clinical science field should be thinking about is, are there cultural adaptations that we should be making? And also what I'm thinking about first, most proximally, is who should I be talking to evaluate the work I've done and clue me into, are there these errors or mistakes I'm making? And I'm hoping even that there's somebody on this call right now that will email me after and educate me about what I could be doing better or who I could be talking to make sure I am being inclusive of all the families I hope to be helping with our work. We also think a lot in our work about retention, and Ron Prinz has been a real pioneer in defining for us how we should be thinking about this. Dropout is not a unitary construct, right? You have your never showed up, which are the people that you just didn't reach at all somehow. You have your early dropout. Those are the people that showed up and thought, this isn't for me. And then you have your late dropout, which is probably a heterogeneous collection of people who got better and don't need it anymore. Those are good dropouts, right? We're happy about them, but maybe some people that tried it and tried really hard and things still aren't better yet, and so they're dropping out. I think we need to do a better job of defining those constructs and then reporting them so that we can learn more about which interventions are working for whom. We also think about dropout from components of treatment. So one of the things we learned in the coaches in schools is that we had a few families that would skip our hour of introduction of parenting strategies and show up when the soccer game started so that they could have their kids playing that and joining that with the children, but they weren't interested in the hour-long discussion. They weren't dropouts, but they were telling us with their feet essentially that some of the treatment components weren't speaking directly to them where others were. And then the other thing we've started to try to study a little bit better is when co-parents are attending our programming, they'll sometimes tag team. They'll both show up for the first session, but then only one parent will show up for session 2 and 3, and then another parent will show up for session 4. I'm curious, I would like to know how that impacts outcomes, because neither parent therefore is getting the entire dose of the intervention as intended. It's kind of like watching, the first part of the movie together and then leaving for the popcorn for a big important scene and then coming back, and the other person leaves during another important scene. Could they really give you a good movie review when that was all done? I don't know the answer to that, and it's something I think should be explored. And then finally, I think we have to think about measurement of outcomes. We need to understand that outcomes are being generated through different lenses. I often sit with parents when I'm talking about a diagnosis of ADHD where they vehemently disagree, where the mother says he has ADHD, has all these problems, and the dad might say, I don't think he has any problems at all, he's just being a kid. Well, most oftentimes, both those parents are right. They're just viewing the child through different lenses, right? The mother is dealing with trying to get the kid ready for school and doing homework and answering all the calls from the teacher, and the dad might not be doing those high demand activities with the kid frequently, in which case we wouldn't expect the kid would have much impairment. And so we have to think carefully about that. We have to, I can't possibly eloquently talk about the management of discrepancies when having Dr. De Los Reyes on the call, as he's a definite expert in this area. But I think we have to think about how to meaningfully integrate the information from all these other sources. Perhaps our outcome measures should be tailored to the important outcomes for the people we're working with. And so, and it may mean that it's a different outcome measure for different parents. And then we should collect treatment satisfaction from everybody. So here's my last slide, just in the interest of wrapping up to make sure there's plenty of time for discussion. Additional future directions, I think, relate to how do we define study participants? Is it the child? Is it the father? Is it the mother? Is it co-parents? Is our participant the family? This is going to have some consequences for how we do random allocation, how we manage outcomes. It's going to also have consequences for the statistical analysis of some of the studies that we propose. I think we need to have a great, and this is something I think about quite often, but what was true in 1999 is not necessarily true today. So we're going to have to think more about the diversity of parenting roles, and that fathers are going to have more diverse parenting roles and moms are going to have more diverse parenting roles. And that's evolving, that's changing all the time. One of the things that the COVID-19 pandemic has done that I'm interested in learning about is families have spent the past 3 months with their children quarantined in a household together. There may have been some fairly dramatic shifts in how parenting is being applied, and demands have changed. People have been doing homeschooling, and their children are no longer in structured activities outside of the home and sports or clubs. That everything's been home-centered. I'm wondering what the consequences of that will be. I think there will be some positive consequences of that for families, but there may be some unintended consequences as well. I think we have to better understand the dynamic role of fathers across contexts, especially time. When we think about birth to young adulthood, I don't feel like we have in the literature a very good handle on how fathers' roles shift and the varying importance of their role at different time periods or different transitions. And we also have to consider that more father involvement is not always welcomed by mothers. And so we have to be careful of just trying to march ahead with, we need to include dads more. I think we have to have a more nuanced approach, that we need to include dads more when it will be helpful, and not necessarily try to paint with a broad brush there. And I always like to show this cartoon. There's no words in it, but I don't think you need any words. It's a nice example, I think, of what we try to do in our clinic when we work with dads, and have them have more positive attachment and a better time with their kids, because in the long run, that's going to accrue positive interest and help kids who need it a lot, because we're working with kids that don't get a lot of attaboys or attagirls. And I think I'll end there.